Edward Gray's boots crunched through the morning frost as he made his way to the chicken coop. The sun hadn't quite crested the horizon, painting the Nebraska sky in watercolor shades of purple and orange. At 68, his joints protested the cold. But 40 years of farming had taught him that routines didn't care about comfort. "All right, ladies," he called out, scattering feet across the ground. The chickens clucked and pecked, their busy movements bringing life to the quiet morning. He collected the eggs with practiced efficiency, tucking them into the worn basket he'd used since Sarah passed 5 years ago. The rest of his morning followed its familiar pattern. The vegetable garden needed weeding, the irrigation system required maintenance, and his small herd of cattle waited for their morning check. Edward found peace in the rhythm of it all, even if the silence sometimes pressed too heavily against his ears. By evening, with the day's work done, Edward settled into his favorite armchair. The leather was cracked and worn, but it held the shape of him perfectly. He reached for his dog-eared copy of Understanding the Cosmos when the first rumble of thunder made him pause. The storm rolled in faster than any he'd seen before. Lightning split the sky in bizarre patterns, more geometric than natural. Edward stood at his window, watching the strange display with growing unease. The cattle were secured in the barn, but something about this storm set his nerves on edge. A flash of brilliant blue-white light erupted from his backfield, followed by a sound like metal tearing. Edward grabbed his raincoat and flashlight, knowing he should check for damage. The rain pelted him as he trudged through the muddy field, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The light he'd seen came from behind his eastern cornfield. As he approached, an otherworldly glow pulsed through the stalks. Edward's heart hammered against his ribs, but curiosity drove him forward. He pushed through the corn and stopped dead in his tracks. A crater scarred his field, steam rising from its edges despite the rain. But it was the figure lying at its center that made his breath catch. She looked almost human, except for her silvery blue skin that seemed to shimmer even in the dim light. Her hair rippled with colors he couldn't name, like mother of pearl caught in sunlight. She lay crumpled on her side, wearing what looked like a suit made of liquid metal. "Good Lord," Edward whispered, taking a tentative step forward. The woman's eyes fluttered open, revealing irises the color of spring leaves. She tried to speak, but the words were unlike anything he'd ever heard. Edward held up his hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. "You're hurt. Let me help you." She struggled to sit up, revealing a nasty gash along her arm that leaked something phosphorescent. When she tried to stand, her legs buckled. Edward moved without thinking, catching her before she hit the ground. "Easy now," he said softly, surprised by how light she felt in his arms. Her skin was warm, almost hot to the touch, and she trembled like a frightened animal. The woman's hand moved to a bracelet on her wrist, pressing something that made it glow. After a moment, she spoke again, and this time her words were in halting English. "Help! Dangerous! Following!" She clutched at his coat, her green eyes wide with fear. "Who's following you?" Edward asked, scanning the dark field. The rain had begun to ease, but lightning still flashed overhead, casting strange shadows across the crater. She shook her head frantically, her iridescent hair catching the light. "No time. Please." Her words came through the bracelet with a slight delay, carrying an electronic undertone. Edward's farm sat isolated from his nearest neighbors by miles of fields. Whatever, or whoever, was after her wouldn't find her easily here. He made his decision. "My house is just over there. Can you walk?" She tried to stand again but swayed dangerously. Without hesitation, Edward scooped her up in his arms. For a moment he felt 30 years younger, remembering how he'd once carried Sarah across this same field during another storm. The walk back to the house seemed longer with his precious cargo. By the time they reached his back porch, his arms trembled from the effort, but he managed to get her inside without stumbling. He set her gently on his worn couch, noticing how her silvery skin left a faint, luminescent trace on his raincoat. "I'm Edward," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "Edward Gray." The woman touched her bracelet again. "Leva," she replied, her voice clearer now through the device. "I apologize for intruding. My ship, malfunction, emergency landing." Edward grabbed the first aid kit from his kitchen, along with some clean towels. "You're bleeding," he said, gesturing to her arm. "May I?" Liva nodded, watching with curious eyes as he cleaned the wound. The phosphorescent fluid that served as her blood glowed brighter when exposed to the antiseptic, but the cut began to seal almost immediately. "Remarkable," Edward murmured. "Advanced healing?" "Yes." Leva's lips curved in what might have been a smile. "Your medicine, primitive but kind intention." She winced, pressing a hand to her side. "Internal damage. Needs time to heal." Edward noticed how her eyes darted to the windows, checking the darkness beyond. "You're safe here," he assured her. "This is private property, miles from anywhere." "They will come," she said softly. "Always come. Must keep moving." "Not tonight," Edward said firmly. "You're injured and exhausted. Whatever's chasing you, you won't escape it in this condition." He stood, his knees cracking. "I have a spare room upstairs. Used to be my wife's sewing room." Leva tilted her head, studying him with those impossibly green eyes. "Wife? Where is she?" "Gone," Edward said simply. 5 years now. Cancer." Something in Leva's expression shifted, a flash of understanding that transcended species. "I am sorry for your loss." Edward nodded, surprised by how much the alien's sympathy moved him. "Come on, let's get you settled." He helped her up the stairs, noting how she seemed to move more easily now. The spare room was small but clean, with a twin bed he'd never quite brought himself to get rid of. Sarah's old quilts still covered it, their familiar patterns a stark contrast to his otherworldly guest. "Rest," he said, turning down the covers. "We'll figure things out in the morning." Leva sat on the bed's edge, running her fingers over the quilt's texture. "You are unusual, Edward Gray. Most humans would fear, report." "Maybe I'm too old to be afraid," he replied with a slight smile. "Or maybe I've just seen enough of life to know that kindness shouldn't depend on where someone's from." As he turned to leave, Leva called out, "Edward?" He looked back to see her silver blue features soft with gratitude. "Thank you." Closing the door, Edward leaned against the wall for a moment, his heart racing with the enormity of what had just happened. In one night, his quiet existence had been completely upended by a beautiful alien fugitive who now slept in his late wife's sewing room. Sarah would have loved this, he thought with a bittersweet smile. She'd always said the stars held secrets worth knowing. Edward barely slept that night. He sat in his armchair downstairs, a loaded shotgun across his lap, watching the darkness through his window. The storm gradually subsided, leaving behind an unsettling stillness. Every creak of the old farmhouse made him tense. Dawn arrived with no sign of pursuit. Edward had just started brewing coffee when he heard soft footsteps on the stairs. Leva appeared in the kitchen doorway, her silvery blue skin catching the morning light in ways that made her seem almost translucent. "Good morning," she said, her translation bracelet making the words clearer than the night before. "Your world's sun. It feels different from mine." Edward poured 2 cups of coffee. "Different how?" "Warmer, more yellow." She accepted the cup with delicate fingers, studying the dark liquid. "What is this?" "Coffee. Careful, it's hot." Leva took a tentative sip, and her eyes widened. The tips of her iridescent hair shifted to a deeper blue. "Strong, but interesting." She took another sip. "My people have nothing like this." Edward leaned against the counter, studying her in the morning light. The metal-like suit she wore had somehow repaired itself overnight, though it still bore traces of damage. "Your people, where are they?" Leva's expression darkened. "Far, very far. A system you cannot see with your telescopes." She set down the coffee cup, her hands trembling slightly. "I am a researcher, studying developing civilizations. But there are others, hunters who—" She broke off, pressing her lips together. "Who want what you know?" Edward guessed. She nodded. "Knowledge is power. Some would use my research to exploit, to harm." Her green eyes met his. "I cannot stay long. They have ways of tracking bioelectric signatures across light years." Edward felt a sudden protectiveness surge through him. "How long until you're strong enough to travel?" 3 of your days, perhaps 4. My healing requires energy." She glanced around his kitchen with obvious curiosity. This place, it reminds me of historical archives. Simple but functional. Simple's not always bad, Edward said, unable to suppress a smile at her diplomatic description of his dated farmhouse. Sometimes it's just what you need to hide in plain sight. Liva's hair shifted to a lighter shade, which Edward was beginning to suspect indicated interest or pleasure. You're very logical, Edward Gray, and very kind. She moved to his kitchen window, gazing out at the farm. May I? Would it be acceptable if I helped with your daily tasks? I should learn about Earth culture while I am here. Edward considered the offer. Having an alien help with farm chores seemed absurd, but her eager expression reminded him so much of Sarah when she'd first moved to the farm as his young bride, determined to learn everything about country life. All right, he agreed, but we'll need to do something about your appearance if anyone drives by. And that suit. Leva touched her bracelet and suddenly her appearance shimmed like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. When it settled, she looked human, pale-skinned with platinum blonde hair. Her suit had transformed into simple jeans and a flannel shirt. Edward blinked in surprise. That's handy. Holographic camouflage, she explained, though her voice carried a hint of strain. It requires energy to maintain, but it will serve for now. Well then, Edward said, gathering his wits, let's start with feeding the chickens. They're usually easier to deal with than cattle for beginners. As they walked to the coop together in the morning light, Edward couldn't help but notice how naturally Leva moved in her human form, though her eyes still held that otherworldly gleam. She asked questions about everything: the construction of the coop, the behavior of the chickens, the composition of their feed. Your species has developed remarkable adaptations, she said, watching a hen scratch for insects, to domesticate other creatures for mutual benefit. Very efficient. We've had a lot of practice, Edward replied, showing her how to scatter the feed. Thousands of years of trial and error. The morning passed in a strange but pleasant rhythm. Leva proved to be a quick learner, though her scientific curiosity led to some amusing moments. She spent 10 minutes analyzing the structure of a chicken egg, and her detailed observations about the photosynthetic processes of his tomato plants made Edward wish he'd paid more attention in high school biology. Around noon, as they finished weeding the vegetable garden, a distant engine sound made them both freeze. A pickup truck was approaching down the long dirt road to the farm. Inside, Edward said quietly, just in case. But Leva stayed put, her holographic disguise flickering slightly with tension. Number. If I act suspicious, it will draw more attention. Better to appear normal. Her voice carried a slight tremor despite her logical words. The truck turned out to be Bill Henderson, Edward's nearest neighbor, 3 miles down the road. His ancient Ford rattled to a stop near the garden, and Bill stepped out, his weathered face creasing with interest at the sight of Leva. Well now, Eddie, Bill called out. Didn't know you had company. Edward's mind raced. This is Laura, my niece from Chicago, visiting for a few days. Leva stepped forward, extending her hand with careful precision, clearly mimicking human gestures she'd observed. Pleased to meet you, sir. Bill shook her hand, his eyes twinkling. City girl, huh? Getting your hands dirty in Uncle Eddie's garden? Yes, Leva replied, her translation bracelet making her voice sound perfectly human. I find the agricultural processes fascinating. The symbiotic relationship between humans and their cultivated species is remarkable for its... Edward coughed loudly. Laura's studying biology, he cut in. Gets a bit technical sometimes. Bill laughed. Well, ain't that something? Listen, Eddie, just came by to warn you. Some folks in town were talking about strange lights in the sky last night. Government types asking questions this morning. Thought you should know, being out here all isolated. Edward felt Leva stiffen beside him. Thanks for the heads up, Bill. Didn't see anything myself. Probably just the storm playing tricks. After Bill left, Leva's holographic disguise flickered again, revealing her true form for a split second. They're closer than I thought, she whispered. I should leave. No, Edward said firmly, surprising himself with the force in his voice. You're not strong enough yet, and running now would only draw attention. He gestured to the house. Come on, let's get you something to eat. Then I'll show you the root cellar. If anyone comes looking, you'll have a place to hide." Over a lunch of sandwiches, which Liva approached with scientific fascination, Edward found himself talking more than he had in years. He told her about Sarah, about their life on the farm, about his love of astronomy that had led to shelves full of books about space. "Your understanding of the cosmos is limited but imaginative," Leva said, paging through one of his books. "Your scientists make remarkable leaps of logic despite their technological constraints." "Is that a compliment or an insult?" Edward asked, amused. Leva's hair shifted to that pleased shade again. "Perhaps both. Your species is paradoxical, primitive in some ways, yet capable of profound insights." She met his eyes, like offering shelter to a strange being who fell from the sky. "Maybe not so strange," Edward said softly. "Lost souls need help sometimes, no matter where they're from." The moment stretched between them, filled with something neither of them quite understood. Then a distant rumble of thunder made them both look up. Another storm was rolling in, but this time Edward suspected it wasn't entirely natural. The afternoon storm brought an unnatural stillness. Even the chickens fell quiet, huddling in their coop as dark clouds gathered overhead. Edward and Leva worked quickly to secure the farm, though his joints protested the rapid movement. "They're searching in a grid pattern," Leva said, her eyes fixed on the sky. Her holographic disguise had dropped, her true form almost luminescent against the darkening day. "The storm, they use it for cover. The electrical interference masks their ships." Edward pulled the last bale of hay into the barn. "How many?" "3 hunters, typically. Small ships, highly maneuverable." Her hand went to her bracelet. "The technology they use to track me, it's like your bloodhounds. They follow the trail of my biological signature." A low hum filled the air, just on the edge of hearing. Edward's cattle began to low nervously in their pens. "The root cellar," he said, taking her arm. "Now." They hurried to the concealed entrance behind the house. Edward had built the cellar himself after the last tornado scare, reinforcing it with concrete and steel. Now he was grateful for his paranoia as he helped Leva down the narrow stairs. "Edward," she caught his hand before he could close the heavy door. "If they come, tell them nothing. They can be persuasive." "I've survived interrogations before," he said grimly, thinking of his time in Vietnam. "Stay quiet, no matter what you hear." The hum grew louder as Edward returned to his house. He settled into his armchair, shotgun across his lap, trying to look like a suspicious old farmer preparing for a storm. His heart pounded, but his hands were steady. The knock, when it came, was almost polite. Edward took his time answering. 3 men stood on his porch, wearing dark suits that seemed to absorb the light. Their faces were too smooth, too perfect to be human. "Mr. Gray," the middle one said, his accent peculiar, "we're with a special division of the government. We'd like to ask you some questions about unusual atmospheric phenomena in this area." "Lot of strange weather lately," Edward replied, keeping his shotgun visible but lowered. "Can't say I've noticed anything specific." The one on the left smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "May we come in?" "This won't take long." Edward knew refusing would only make them more suspicious. He stepped aside, watching as they moved through his house with unnaturally fluid grace. They asked their questions with mechanical precision, but their eyes roamed constantly, searching. Edward played his role, the slightly deaf, slightly suspicious old farmer, answering their queries with rural directness while revealing nothing. Then the third one paused by his bookshelf. "You have quite an interest in astronomy, Mr. Gray." "Started when I was a boy," Edward said easily. "Something about the stars just catches a person, you know." The middle one stepped closer, his perfect face hardening. "Indeed. And what do you think about the possibility of life out there, Mr. Gray?" Edward met his inhuman gaze steadily. "Seems mighty arrogant to think we're alone in all that space. But if anything's out there, I expect they've got better things to do than bother an old farmer in Nebraska." A tense silence followed. Edward could feel their frustration building like static before a lightning strike. But whatever they were bound by certain rules, certain appearances they had to maintain. Finally, the first one nodded. Thank you for your time, Mr. Gray. If you notice anything unusual, please contact this number. He placed a black card on the table. Edward waited until their unmarked car had disappeared down his drive before hurrying to the root cellar. Liva was huddled in the darkest corner, her silvery skin dimmed to almost gray. They're gone, he said softly, but they'll be back. Liva rose shakily. You handled them well. Most humans cannot resist their mental probing so easily. Probably too old and stubborn for them to get a good read, Edward said, helping her up the stairs. We need to get you stronger. Fast. In his kitchen, Liva suddenly swayed, her camouflage flickering wildly. Edward caught her before she fell, surprised again by how natural it felt to hold her. Sorry, she whispered. The energy expenditure, hiding my signature, it takes much strength. Then rest, Edward said firmly. I'll keep watch. We'll figure this out together. As he helped her to the stairs, Liva paused. Why are you risking so much for me, Edward Gray? Edward thought of Sarah, of stars, of all the choices that led to this moment. Because sometimes the right thing to do is also the craziest thing imaginable. That earned him a genuine smile, her hair shimmering with colors he had no names for. And as the storm raged outside, Edward realized his quiet life had transformed into something far more dangerous and far more meaningful than he could have imagined. In the days following the hunter's visit, Edward and Liva fell into an unexpected rhythm. The morning after the interrogation, he found her in his library, surrounded by stacks of books. Her hair rippled with excitement as she devoured texts on human culture, history, and science. Your species writes everything down, she observed, looking up as he brought her coffee. Her skin seemed to glow more intensely in the morning light. On my world, we share knowledge through direct neural transmission. Edward settled into his armchair, noticing how she'd gravitated toward the romance novels Sarah had collected. Must be more efficient than reading. Efficient, yes, but it lacks texture. Liva's fingers traced the spine of Pride and Prejudice. These stories of human courtship, they're fascinating. So many rules, yet so much passion beneath them. Edward shifted uncomfortably. Sarah loved those books, said they reminded her that love's complications never really change. Tell me about her, Liva said softly, about your courtship. The request caught him off guard. It was simple, really. Met at a county fair. She was selling pies for her church. I was young and cocky. Told her I made better pies myself. Did you? Lord, no, but it made her laugh. Edward smiled at the memory. She challenged me to prove it. Spent a week learning to bake just to save face. Liva leaned forward, her green eyes intense. And this impressed her? The effort to learn a new skill for her attention? The pies were terrible, Edward admitted, but she said any man willing to make a fool of himself for love was worth keeping around. A strange shimmer passed across Liva's skin. Your temperature increases when you speak of her. Your pupils dilate. She pressed a hand to her own chest. It causes an echo in me, a resonance. Edward noticed her skin's glow had intensified. Sweat beaded on her forehead, despite the cool morning. Are you feeling all right? I dot. Liva stood abruptly, swaying slightly. I need air. He followed her outside, watching as she tilted her face to the sun. Her hair swirled with new colors, deep purples and blues he hadn't seen before. Would you teach me? She asked suddenly. Teach you what? Everything. How to tend your plants, care for your animals, cook your food. She turned to him, her movements more fluid than usual. I want to understand, to experience. Sure, Edward said, trying to ignore how her intensity made his pulse quicken. We can start with the tomatoes. They need staking. As they worked in the garden, Edward couldn't help but notice how Liva's movements had changed. Her usual scientific precision was replaced by something more graceful. She stayed closer to him than necessary, her questions becoming increasingly personal. These tomato plants, she said, her fingers trailing along a vine, they need support to grow properly, like humans need companionship. Edward focused on tying the plants to their stakes. I suppose that's one way to look at it. And you, Edward? Her voice carried a new warmth that made him look up. Do you not need support? Companionship? I manage, he said gruffly, though his heart had started racing. Plants are simpler than people. Leva moved closer, her skin pulsing with a soft luminescence. Simple is not always better. You taught me that. The air between them felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. Edward took a deliberate step back, clearing his throat. Let's check on the chickens. Throughout the day, Leva's behavior grew increasingly unpredictable. She asked about human mating rituals with an intensity that made Edward's ears burn. Her skin temperature rose steadily, and the glow beneath her surface brightened until she seemed to shimmer in the shadows. By evening, she was pacing the library restlessly, her hair cycling through colors faster than Edward could track. These romance novels, she said, holding up one of Sarah's old books, they describe physical symptoms similar to what I'm experiencing. Increased heart rate, skin sensitivity, persistent thoughts of... She broke off, pressing a hand to her chest. Liva, Edward said carefully, what's happening to you? She sank onto the couch, her form wavering between her true appearance and her human disguise. My species, we have a biological cycle, usually controlled through medical intervention on my world. But here, she looked at him with those impossible green eyes. Prolonged exposure to compatible, intelligent life can trigger it. Edward's mouth went dry. Trigger what, exactly? Our mating season. The words came out in a rush. The drive to connect, to bond, to... She stood suddenly, moving toward him with fluid grace. Your presence affects me, Edward Gray. Your kindness, your wisdom, your... Her hand reached for his face. Edward caught her wrist gently but firmly. Leva, you're not thinking clearly. I have never thought more clearly, she whispered. Her skin burned hot against his palm. On my world, we choose mates based on genetic compatibility, intellectual resonance. But you make me feel things I don't have words for. It's just biology, Edward said, trying to convince himself as much as her. Your system's out of balance. It'll pass. Leva's hair darkened to deep crimson. Will it? Or is that what you need to believe? She pulled away, wrapping her arms around herself. I should go. Before ... You're not going anywhere, Edward said firmly. Those hunters are still out there. We'll figure this out. But as he watched her retreat upstairs, her form trailing starlight, Edward wondered if he was in far deeper trouble than any alien hunters could cause. Because despite every rational argument against it, despite the decades between them and the galaxies that separated their species, he was starting to feel things he hadn't felt since Sarah, and that terrified him more than any threat from the stars. The next few days tested Edward's resolve in ways he'd never imagined. Leva's condition intensified, making it increasingly difficult for them to maintain normal interactions. Her skin now pulsed with light that matched her heartbeat, and her hair had settled into deep, passionate shades of burgundy and violet. One morning, he found her in the kitchen attempting to recreate Sarah's pie recipe from his memories. I accessed your cookbook collection, she explained, covered in flour. The white powder made her skin sparkle like diamond dust. I wanted to understand, to experience what she felt when creating for you. Edward's chest tightened at the sight. You don't have to. But I want to, she interrupted, stepping closer. Everything about humans fascinates me, Edward. But you... Her hand trembled as she reached toward him, stopping just short of touching his chest. You defy all my scientific understanding. He could feel the heat radiating from her body, see the way her pupils had expanded to nearly eclipse the green. Leva, your heart rate increases when I'm near, she observed, her voice husky. Your body temperature elevates. These are the same symptoms I'm experiencing. Yet you resist them. Why? Edward stepped back, bumping into the counter. Because you're not yourself right now. This is your biology talking, not... Do not dismiss my feelings as mere biology, she said fiercely. Her hair flared with colors he'd never seen before. I am a scientist. I know the difference between biological imperatives and genuine connection. The oven timer saved him from responding. The pie, when she removed it, was oddly shaped but smelled wonderful. Sarah's recipe was imprecise, Leva said, setting it to cool. It called for a pinch of love. I find such measurements challenging. Despite everything, Edward laughed. Some things can't be measured, Leva. She turned to him, and the look in her eyes made his laughter die in his throat. Then help me understand them. Before he could respond, a sharp pain lanced through her body. She doubled over, her form flickering wildly between alien and human appearance. Leva! Edward caught her before she could fall. Her skin burned against his hands. The cycle, she gasped. Without proper regulation, it's becoming difficult to control. My body's chemistry. She clutched at him, her fingers leaving trails of light on his shirt. Edward, I need... What? What do you need? She looked up at him, her eyes now swirling with all the colors of a nebula. You! But I won't force. My people have strict protocols about consent. Edward held her, his heart pounding as she trembled in his arms. Everything about this was impossible, inappropriate, potentially disastrous. Yet watching her struggle against her nature, while still trying to respect his boundaries, moved something deep inside him. We'll figure this out, he said softly, stroking her luminescent hair. Together. She pressed closer, her breath coming in quick gasps. The hunters, they can track the energy signature, getting stronger. Let them come, Edward said with sudden fierceness. We'll deal with that too. That evening, a summer storm rolled in, different from the artificial ones the hunters used. Real lightning illuminated Leva's form as she stood by the library window, her own light pulsing in rhythm with the thunder. Your earth storms, she murmured as Edward entered with tea. They're like what's happening inside me. Wild, uncontrolled, beautiful. Edward set down the cups, noticing how the steam curled toward her as if drawn by some invisible force. You should try to rest. Rest? She turned to him, and his breath caught. Her entire being seemed to shimmer with barely contained energy. How can I rest when every cell in my body is calling out for... She stopped, pressing her hands against the window glass. On my world, this would be controlled, clinical, regulated by machines and protocols. And here? Edward asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Here, I feel everything. Her words came out almost as a moan. Every sensation is amplified. The texture of these clothes against my skin, the taste of the air, the sound of your heartbeat. Edward realized he'd moved closer without conscious thought. Leva! She turned to face him, her back against the window. Lightning flashed, outlining her form in brilliant white. Tell me you don't feel it too. This connection between us. I'm too old for... Age is meaningless to my species, she interrupted. We measure compatibility through resonance of mind and spirit. And yours. Her hand reached out, hovering just above his chest. Yours calls to mind like a song I've always known but never heard. Thunder crashed overhead, and suddenly the power went out, plunging them into darkness. But Leva's natural bioluminescence filled the room with a soft, otherworldly glow. Beautiful, Edward whispered before he could stop himself. Leva's hair rippled with pleasure at the compliment. Edward, she said softly, my people believe that true connections transcend physical forms, that souls recognize each other across species, across space itself. And what do you believe? He asked, his heart pounding. I believe... She moved closer, her heat searing through his clothes. I believe the universe brought me here for a reason, to this planet, this farm, this moment. Their faces were inches apart now. Edward could see the swirling cosmos in her eyes, feel the electric charge of her skin. Everything about this was impossible, yet felt more right than anything had since Sarah's death. Just then, a high-pitched whine cut through the storm's rumble. Leva stiffened, her glow dimming. They're coming. The energy signature. They can track it now. Edward straightened, years of military training kicking in. The root cellar? No, Leva said firmly. I won't hide anymore. Not from them, and not from what I feel. She took his face in her hands, her touch sending sparks through his entire body. Edward Gray, The sound of vehicles approaching cut her off. Headlights swept across the windows as multiple cars turned into his drive. "Well," Edward said, covering her hands with his own, "looks like we'll have to finish this conversation later." Leva's hair swirled with determined colors. "Yes, later. Because there will be a later, Edward. I promise you that." As they moved to face whatever was coming, Edward realized that somehow, impossibly, he'd fallen in love with a being from another world. And he'd be damned if he'd let anyone take her away. The hunters' vehicles surrounded the farmhouse, their headlights cutting through the storm like alien eyes. Edward stood at his front door, shotgun ready, while Liva's form pulsed with barely contained energy beside him. "Let me handle this," he said quietly. "Together," she corrected, her hand finding his in the darkness. The touch sent waves of warmth through his entire body. The approaching figures weren't the same hunters as before. These moved with military precision, their suits more obviously armored. Their leader stepped forward, his face inhumanly perfect under the porch light. "Researcher Liva," his voice carried artificial harmonics, "your unauthorized exodus ends here. The knowledge you carry is too valuable to risk contamination." Liva's grip tightened on Edward's hand. "My research belongs to no one, and I've learned more about genuine connection in these few days than in all my years of clinical observation." "Your judgment is compromised by your biological cycle," another hunter stated. "The human's influence has corrupted your scientific objectivity." Edward felt Leva's temperature spike. "You speak of corruption?" Her voice carried new strength. "You who would weaponize my studies of emerging civilizations? Who would turn understanding into exploitation?" Lightning flashed, illuminating dozens of armed figures surrounding them. The lead hunter's perfect face showed no emotion. "This is your final warning. Come willingly, or we will be forced to take more drastic measures." Edward shifted slightly, positioning himself between Liva and the hunters. "This is private property. You have no authority here." "Mr. Gray," the hunter's smile was terrible in its beauty, "your species' legal concepts are irrelevant to us. However, your connection to our quarry is noteworthy. Perhaps you'd like to understand exactly what you're harboring." He held up a device that projected a holographic display. Images flashed. Laiva on different worlds, observing, recording, her true form shifting through various disguises. "She is not what you think," the hunter continued. "Her kind studies lesser species like humans view insects. Clinical, detached. Any emotional response you believe you're receiving is merely biological manipulation." "Is that true?" Edward asked softly, not looking at Leva, but keeping his eyes on the hunters. Her response came with fierce intensity. "I was like that once. Clinical, detached." Her form blazed brighter. "But you taught me something they could never understand. The difference between observing life and truly living it." The lead hunter made a gesture, and his forces began to advance. "Enough of this primitive sentiment. Take them both." Edward raised his shotgun. "I may be primitive, but I've dealt with your kind before." Before he could fire, Leva stepped forward. Her entire body erupted with light so bright it forced the hunters back. "No more hiding," she declared. "No more running." The air crackled with energy as she raised her translation bracelet. But instead of speaking, she began broadcasting something, a signal that made the hunters freeze in their tracks. "What are you doing?" the leader demanded, his perfect facade cracking. "Transmitting my real research findings," Leva said, her voice carrying harmonics that shook the ground. "To every scientific outpost in this sector, the truth about Earth, about humans, about genuine connection. You're violating every protocol. Your protocols were designed to prevent understanding, not foster it." Her free hand found Edward's again. "I came here to study human relationships. Instead, I experienced one, and I finally understand what my research was missing." The signal from her bracelet grew stronger. The hunters' forms began to waver, their disguises failing under its influence. Edward watched in amazement as their true forms were revealed, crystalline beings of pure energy, trapped in containment suits. "You see?" Leva's voice softened. "We're all more than our biological imperatives, more than our assigned roles. Look at yourselves. Even you have been changed by this world, though you fight to deny it. The lead hunter staggered, his crystalline form pulsing with confused colors. This, this is unprecedented. The council ... A new sound cut through the night, a deep resonant tone that made Edward's bones vibrate. A light far brighter than Leiva's descended from the storm clouds. The hunters looked up in obvious recognition and fear. The council, Leiva confirmed, responding to my full report, not just about humans, but about the hunters' true agenda. The massive ship that emerged from the clouds defied Earth physics. It seemed to bend light and space around itself, its surface rippling like liquid metal. As it descended, all the hunters' weapons and devices powered down. A beam of pure energy connected with the ground, and from it emerged a being that made the hunters look primitive by comparison. Its form shifted through multiple dimensions, settling into a vaguely humanoid shape that sparkled like a constellation given form. Researcher Leiva, it spoke, its voice resonating in multiple frequencies. We have received your transmission. Most illuminating. The hunters dropped to their knees. Their leader's crystalline form trembled. Council Elder, we were only... Silence. The elder's form pulsed with authority. Your corruption of our scientific principles has been noted. You will return for rehabilitation. Edward felt Leiva's grip tighten on his hand as the elder turned its attention to them. Its multidimensional gaze seemed to pierce through to his very soul. Most fascinating, it said. A genuine cross-species bonding, unprecedented in our records. Not unprecedented, Leiva replied firmly. Simply unrecognized. We've been so focused on studying humanity's technological development that we missed their greatest achievement, their capacity for connection. The elder moved closer, its form shifting through colors Edward had no names for. You wish to stay with this human? Yes, Leiva's answer came without hesitation. Even knowing it will mean giving up your position, your access to our technology, the difference in your lifespans alone? My people can transfer consciousness, Leiva interrupted. Adapt our forms. I've already begun the process of cellular modification to match Earth biology. She looked at Edward, her eyes swirling with emotion. If that's what you want. Edward stared at her, his heart pounding. You'd give up everything? Your whole world? Edward Gray, she said softly, her hair rippling with those colors he'd come to recognize as joy. You are my world now. The elder's form pulsed with what might have been amusement. Perhaps your research has indeed revealed something valuable, Researcher Leiva, or should I say, former researcher. With a gesture, the elder caused all the hunters to vanish in flashes of light. Their vehicles disappeared as if they'd never existed, leaving only pressed grass as evidence of their presence. You understand, the elder addressed Edward directly, that this decision is irreversible. She will be bound to Earth, to its limitations, to you. Edward straightened his shoulders, feeling every one of his 68 years, even as his heart felt decades younger. With all due respect, what I understand is that she's free to make her own choices. And if she chooses to stay, he turned to Leiva, his voice softening, then I choose to spend whatever time we have making sure she never regrets it. Leiva's entire form blazed with joy, her hair cycling through colors so rapidly it looked like an aurora. The elder's constellation form shifted in what might have been approval. Then it is done. The elder raised its multidimensional hands. Energy flowed from them, surrounding Leiva. Her alien form began to shift, the change more permanent than her usual disguise. When it finished, she looked human. Almost. Her eyes retained their impossible green, and her hair still shimmered with subtle colors in certain lights. The transformation will complete over time, the elder explained. You will age as humans do from this point forward. Your abilities will diminish, but some qualities will remain. Thank you, Leiva whispered, examining her new hands with wonder. The elder began to fade. Your final research paper will be added to our highest archives, Leiva, on the nature of human connection, a most unexpected but valuable contribution to our understanding. As the ship disappeared back into the storm clouds, Edward and Leiva stood alone on his porch, the rain washing away the last traces of the extraordinary events that had just occurred. "So," Edward said, suddenly feeling awkward. "Welcome home?" Leva laughed, the sound still carrying ethereal harmonics. "Home," she tested the word. "Yes, although—" She moved closer, her now human hand touching his chest. "Home isn't this place, Edward. It's you." 6 months later, the neighbors had mostly stopped gossiping about Edward Gray's mysterious young wife. They still whispered about how she seemed to glow when she was happy, how her garden grew impossibly well, and how the northern lights appeared more frequently over their farm than anywhere else in Nebraska. But Edward didn't care about the whispers. Every morning he woke to find Liva already up, usually reading one of Sarah's old books, or making increasingly successful attempts at pie baking. Every evening, they sat on the porch together, her head on his shoulder as they watched the stars. Stars that now held different meanings for them both. "Any regrets?" he asked her one such evening, watching her hair shimmer with contentment in the twilight. "Only that it took crossing galaxies to find you," she replied, taking his hand. Her skin still carried that familiar warmth that had first drawn him to her. Above them, a shooting star traced its path across the sky. But they both knew it might not be a star at all, just the council checking in on their most unusual research subject, a love that transcended the boundaries of worlds. 5 years after Liva chose Earth as her home, the Gray farm buzzed with a different kind of energy. The sound of children's laughter echoed across the fields, carrying those same ethereal harmonics that marked their mother's voice. Sarah Luna Gray, their 4-year-old daughter, had inherited her mother's shimmering hair and her father's quiet wisdom. She could often be found in the garden, talking to plants in ways that made them grow twice as fast as they should. Her eyes shifted between Edward's warm brown and Leva's alien green, depending on her mood. The decision to name their daughter Sarah Luna Gray carried deep meaning for both Edward and Leva. During one of their quiet evening conversations before Sarah's birth, Leva had asked Edward to tell her more about his late wife. "Sarah always said our love was written in the stars," Edward had explained, his voice soft with memory. "She was the one who bought me my first astronomy book." Leva, her form glowing softly in the twilight, had taken his hand. "Then she was the first step on the path that led us to each other. Without her influence on you, without your love of the stars she inspired, you might never have taken in a strange creature who fell from the sky." When their daughter was born, it was Leva who suggested the name. "Sarah," she'd said, holding their newborn whose hair already showed signs of starlight shimmer, "to honor the woman who taught you how to love so deeply that it echoed across galaxies. And Luna," she'd added with a smile, "because like Earth's moon, she'll be a constant reminder of how beauty can bridge the gap between Earth and stars." Edward had been moved to tears by the gesture. In Liva's culture, names were chosen to reflect connections, not just to family, but to the cosmic forces that shaped their lives. By naming their daughter after his late wife, Leva acknowledged that Sarah's love remained a part of their story, not as a shadow over their happiness, but as the first light that had guided them to each other. The name served as a beautiful reminder that love doesn't end. It transforms like energy in the universe, taking new forms while honoring what came before. Their youngest, Thomas Stellar Gray, just 2.5, possessed an uncanny ability to predict weather patterns and could sometimes be found floating a few inches above his crib when excited. His giggles literally lit up the room, his skin glowing softly like his mother's used to do. "They're perfect," Edward marveled one evening, watching Sarah explain the concept of photosynthesis to her younger brother using words no ordinary 4-year-old should know. "Different, but perfect." Liva wrapped her arms around him from behind, her touch still carrying that familiar warmth. "Just like us." The children had changed everything. Edward, who'd once felt his age in every joint and muscle, now found himself racing across the farm, playing elaborate games of hide-and-seek that sometimes involved interdimensional spaces, thanks to Sarah's unique interpretation of the game. His hair might have been silver, but his eyes sparkled with renewed youth. "You know," he said, turning to face his wife, "I feel younger now at 73 than I did at 68 when you crashed into my field." Leva's hair shimmered with joy, a trait both children had inherited. The council's scientists have a theory about that. Apparently, my cellular adaptation to Earth biology had some unexpected effects on those in close proximity, especially given our intimate connection. Are you saying you're literally keeping me young? Edward chuckled. I'm saying love is the most powerful force in any galaxy, she replied, pressing a kiss to his cheek. Even if it's not entirely within known physics. Sarah's voice called from the garden. Daddy! Tommy's trying to teach the chickens to levitate again. Edward laughed, feeling that familiar surge of energy as he headed out to deal with their latest family adventure. The neighbors had long since gotten used to the unusual occurrences at the Gray farm. The occasional floating child, the spectacular aurora displays during family celebrations, and the way their crops seemed to dance in time with Sarah's lullabies. As he watched his children play under the setting sun, their forms slightly shimmering like their mothers, Edward reflected on how life had changed. He wasn't just alive anymore. He was living a new kind of life, one filled with wonders he'd never imagined possible. No regrets? Leva asked, coming to stand beside him, echoing their old evening ritual. Edward pulled her close, feeling the warmth of her love flow through him like cosmic energy. Only that we can't live forever to see what these little stars of ours will do next. Leva's hair rippled with mischief. Well, about that forever part, the Council's latest research on human-alien hybrid genetics suggests. Above them, the stars began to twinkle, as if sharing in a cosmic joke about just how endless love's possibilities could be. Dear friends, the story of Edward and Leva is more than just a tale of love between a man and an alien. It's a narrative about how true feelings can overcome any boundaries of age, origin, or even the very nature of existence. In a world often divided by prejudice and fear, this story reminds us that love can blossom in the most unexpected places. A retired farmer and an alien researcher found in each other not just a companion, but a kindred spirit whose light brightened each day. What moved you the most in their story? Was it the moment Edward first found Laiva in his field? Or the scene where she tried to bake a pie using Sarah's recipe? Perhaps you were especially touched by the arrival of their extraordinary children? Share your thoughts in the comments. Which moments made you smile? Which ones made your heart race? Every story lives on in the hearts of its listeners, and your perspective can uncover new dimensions to this tale. And remember, somewhere out there among the stars, perhaps right now, the Council might be reading Liva's research on the nature of human connection, marveling at how much humanity has to teach even the most advanced civilizations about the power of love. Leave your comments. Let's continue this conversation about a love that transcends the boundaries of galaxies. P.S. Do you have ideas about what adventures might await the Gray family next? Share your thoughts.